But I am talking about a couple of points from Galatians, especially Galatians 3. Um, and I got on this topic actually reading one of the articles in this Bible, commentaries in this Bible here, and it referred you back to a website article written in 1994, and on the Christian Biblical Church of God website, the people behind this Bible. Um, the article was written by Carl D. Franklin. I don't know if that's a relation to the Franklins here or not. Probably not, it sounds like. But anyway, it was on the oneness of God. It's the article, and uh, so the point he brought out was one of those that maybe I'm the only one in here that didn't get it, but I thought it was a new point to me, and I thought a good one. And then that just kind of worked into talking about the rest of the verse that had some other interesting stuff in it, I thought. But anyway, and you may probably recall, some of y'all don't because you weren't in this group yet, but in 94 was about the time they had that pretty big controversy over the nature of God. And Worldwide was trying to squeeze in the Trinity without using the word Trinity. I mean, so anyway, I believe that's how this article came to be based on the time frame and the topic. But so anyway, and the way this relates to Galatians is the phrase, but God is one. So and so I'll just read it in the New King James, verse 19 and 20. So what purpose does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. Now, a mediator does not mediate for only one, but God is one. And so there's the phrase, but God is one. And to me, this is kind of a little bit of a difficult passage to understand all that's going on in here. And but here's the King James, and to me, it's even a little more difficult. And I'll just read the second part of that. And it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now, a mediator is not a mediator of one, but God is one. So, according to the article, some, especially pro-Trinitarian, take this verse, God is one, as a part talking about the nature of God. They would say it shows that God is one and only one being. And so, as an explanation, let me just read from the article, its explanation of this verse. And it's got several, parentheses. So it goes, wherefore then serves the law? The Mosaic covenant. It was added, and they say placed or laid beside the Abrahamic covenant because of transgressions of humans before Moses, till the seed, obviously Jesus Christ, should come to whom the promise was made. And it, the Mosaic covenant, was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator, Moses. Now, a mediator is not a mediator of one. In other words, a mediator arranges the terms between two separate parties. But God is one. And they're saying that is, he's the only party obligated in the Abrahamic covenant. There wasn't a mediator, because it didn't say this, but it really wasn't a covenant. It was God making promises to Abraham. Abraham didn't have to do anything on his side. He'd already showed his faith. God didn't have any additional requirements on Abraham. But so what it's saying is, Paul's point is nothing to do about the nature of God, how many beings or anything. He's just saying in a contract, you have two. In just a gift, you don't have but one. And so on that side of the ledger, in this arrangement, in the Abrahamic covenant, Abrahamic covenant or whatever, uh, there's only one. So it's just saying there was only one side of this negotiation. It has zero to do with the nature of God. Now, of course, other verses do say, like Jesus said, my Father and I are one and stuff. So there is some of that in the Bible, but this verse here, unrelated to that. And that was sort of I never thought about that before, and that's the part that was kind of new to me. Some of the other translations trip you up less, I feel like. So here's the New International Version. So the law was given through angels and entrusted to a mediator. A mediator, however, implies more than one party, but God is one. And the New American Standard said, having been ordered through angels at the hand of a mediator, until the seed would come to whom the promise had been made. Now, a mediator is not for one party only, but God is only one. So I think that is a good explanation and interpretation of what that means. There's another interesting phrase in this verse, and depending on which of those translations, it says that the Mosaic covenant was ordained by angels, given through angels, or ordered through angels. And I have no idea exactly what he's talking about, because we know that Moses saw the back of God himself, and that God wrote the 10 Commandments with his own finger. And a whole bunch of times it says God spoke, later on for all the other commandments, it says God spoke to Moses and thus, and God spoke to Moses and do this and that. So I don't know what that's talking about. And so I'll be happy for anybody that doesn't know to clue me in. Some of the commentaries I read did have the same problem, though. They go, well, this is a little hard to understand what they're talking about. And you can give a lot of theories, and I'm not going to do that right now because it's just taking guesses. But I just thought I'd point that out as something I don't understand about that verse. So the other interesting phrase in this little passage was it says the law was added until the seed should come. And so to examine this phrase, let me start at the back of Galatians and to get the whole context. So keep in mind that Galatians is a letter. It's not like I don't know, an overall doctrinal paper or something. It's a letter Paul was writing to a group of Christians that lived in modern day Turkey. They would have been Gentile to start off with, born with a pagan religion. However, they were obviously being influenced by, I'm assuming, Christians who had taken the wrong tack of thinking you had to be Jewish to be saved. And so I'll read verses 2 through 4 to mention that. So indeed, I, Paul, say that to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You are estranged from Christ, you who attempt to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. So being circumcised as an adult is an initiation into Judaism. It's just another way of saying you became Jewish. I view it as an analogous to getting baptized as a Christian. You're initiated into a Christian church. So the main point of Galatians, of all of it, is that Christians are not bound by the Mosaic covenant, but are to live under faith in Jesus. And so the wait a second. Okay, so in Galatians 2, I left out a verse here. I'm going to go read it. Man, actually using the Bible I brought up here. Anyway, Galatians 1 verse 6. I must have deleted something I didn't mean to. Anyway, so Paul gets into the theory, not theory, the thesis of what his whole letter's about in Galatians 1 verse 6. I am astonished. So, like a lot of times he has a bunch of lead in. This is verse 6, like the third sentence. He gets right into it. I am astonished that you are so quickly turned away from him who called you into the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which in reality is not another gospel, but there are some who are troubling you, desiring to pervert the gospel of Christ. And we find out later that they're trying to Judaize them, basically. So from there in Galatians 2, Paul gives a history of his own personal Christian walk. He recounts a few episodes involving Gentiles and Jews. His experience and testimony was that the gospel was as much for the Gentiles as it was for the Jews. And he even gives an example of where Peter, interestingly, because Peter first went to Cornelius, who's a Gentile, but Peter got caught up in discriminating essentially against Gentiles, and Paul reproached him for that. And so that's part of what Galatians 2 is about. And and here's part of the response about Paul's recounting what he was telling Peter in verse 16. It says, even we, speaking of Jews, have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. For the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified. And that's a lead-in to Galatians 3. So to further illustrate his point, he brings in the contrast of the Abrahamic covenant versus the Mosaic covenant. So I think it's just another example he was using. The two covenant comparison wasn't like his main point. It just was a supporting of his main point, I feel like. So for example, in verse 7, to show some of the contrast, in Galatians 3 verse 7, it says, therefore know that only those who are of faith are the sons of Abraham. And so to me, that's showing his point is contrasting the covenant with Abraham. And then in verse 15, he says, brethren, I speak in the manner of men, though it is only a man's covenant, yet if it is confirmed, no one annuls or adds to it. So what Paul's saying here is that even in everyday secular matters, if there's a confirmed covenant, you can't just go and annul it. In verse 16, it says, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. And he does not say into seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ. So what Paul is doing here is in his analogy tying the promises to Abraham with the coming of Jesus. And this I say, the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect. For if inheritance is of the law, it is no longer a promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. What purpose does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions, until the seed should come to who the promise was made. So that's the verse I want to concentrate on. It says the purpose of the law was a time frame between Moses and Jesus. And to me, that verse, based on the fact we observe most of the law, has given me trouble. What did it mean? I remember back when I was a kid, fairly young, 13, 14, I don't remember, talking about that verse with my father. And now we were in the Worldwide Church of God at the time. And I don't know if this was his opinion or the company line that Worldwide taught, because members pretty much towed the line, but this may have been his opinion. But he told me his interpretation of this verse is that when it said added, it's talking about the laws that were added, such as sacrifices and things like that. In other words, we are still under that law. It's just the ones that were added, we don't, not necessarily. Well, that never satisfied me as an answer, because if we look in verse 17, it says that law which was 430 years later. To me, that's clearly talking about the 10 Commandments and, the other commandments that came along with that. So I think maybe that viewpoint was an overreaction to the viewpoint of mainstream Christianity. I mean, so far, everything I've said sounds like I could be in a Baptist church, right? The, the, because, when they say the law ended, they think that's all of it. Yeah, none of it is in effect anymore, basically. But it's not saying that. It's saying that what I think the correct interpretation is that as that Church of God biblical article is saying, is that it's the Mosaic covenant. So, in other words, it would say the Mosaic covenant was between that time, and that the Mosaic covenant ended after the Christ's coming, that you're no longer obligated to keep that. And the reason we know it's a covenant, so the law, how do I know that's talking about a covenant and not just God's law in general? Well, for one, that verse that says the hand of a mediator. Well, a mediator is not required for a law. A law is given and you just have to do it. A mediator is only necessary when there's a two parties in a covenant. And so, and then we also further know that means it's a covenant. Another clue is in chapter 4, verse 22. Chapter 4, verse of Galatians still. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a bondwoman, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through the promise, which things are symbolic. So he's saying, hey, look, don't get too excited. This is just symbols. But these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai. So he just right there says, look, I'm talking about the covenant that was created at Mount Sinai. And to me, this is where mainstream Christianity takes the wrong turn. They interpret that there's no laws that we have to keep anymore. But Paul, not just here, but in a lot of places, but in Galatians, right in the middle of this, he gives a caution. In Galatians 2, verse 17, it says, but if we, so right after he had got through saying in verse 16, that a man's not justified by works of the law, and he pulls it up here, he goes, but if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we are ourselves found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not. For if I build again those things which I destroyed, in other words, if I continue sinning, I make myself a transgressor. By definition, if you can be a sinner or a transgressor, you're breaking some type of law. So saying that we are not under the Mosaic covenant really doesn't say anything about which individual laws are still in effect. You have to go to the other parts of the Bible to determine that. Now, certain laws like circumcision and sacrifice were explicitly said they're canceled. Don't do those. Matter of fact, don't do those anymore. Now, circumcision, it's not a sin to get circumcised, but obviously we do do that as a baby. So it's, you don't convert and then do it when you become a Christian, right? Um, the other laws, such as the Sabbath, have plenty of evidence that they're still in effect. Um, but the point is, just saying you're not under the Mosaic covenant really doesn't tell you one way or the other what you do have to do. Except that you do not convert to Judaism. He is saying that. Especially if you do that because you think that's what you need to do to be saved. So for one last point, we don't really like the phrase that we're not under the law. I mean, that's kind of gets us a little bit edgy, right? Because it gets a little close to conceding a point to the Baptists and Methodists and stuff. Well, obviously, that phrase is in the Bible several times, so we shouldn't be afraid of it. And I think the common viewpoint of Church of God people is that we're not under the penalty of the law. Now, I could be mistaken, frequently am, wouldn't be surprised if I am again. But I completely disagree with that interpretation. So, for example, in Galatians 4:4, it says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." So I would say, here's an example of where Jesus was not born under the penalty of the law. He did pay that penalty, even though he wasn't due it. I mean, he paid it. And that's a lot of the salvation story, right? That's the whole point. But saying he was born under the Mosaic covenant, yeah, that fits perfect. And I believe that's the correct interpretation there. Also, the fact that the rest of Galatians is talking about the law being the Mosaic covenant. But here's where saying that happens more often. It's verse 5:18, Galatians 5:18. It says, "But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." And this is where we're inclined to substitute, we're not under the penalty of the law. Of course, it is true you're not under the penalty of law if you are led by the Spirit. You're not in the penalty. You won't suffer the eternal penalty, period, right? But to me, the correct substitution here would be, you are not under the Mosaic covenant and thus not required to become Jewish. So if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the Mosaic covenant and no requirement to become Jewish. Now, that may seem silly to us, but back then, that's what they knew. Being Jewish was the way to go. And so that's why they talk so much about it. To us, that's not a societal pressure, but back then it was. So anyway, that's I've got here right conclusion. Unfortunately, I didn't do that, so I guess I'll just close with nothing.